It's innocent until proven guilty, right? Am I wrong or am I right?
You are entitled to your due process, absolutely.
This is insane. Know what else to say other than please allow me.
You keep saying you don't remember and you don't have any recollection.
Well,
but if somebody was
I mean,
not involved, it would be an adamant, I didn't do it.
I didn't do it. I definitely didn't do it. Like, this is absolutely, I
don't know either. That's why we wanted to talk to you. I don't know why your blood is there also. I don't know.
The story begins in Chevy Chase, Maryland, though its echoes have reverberated far beyond. In 2001, Leslie Prier, mother, friend, neighbor, someone's mom, was murdered in her own home. The brutality of the crime shook the community. She was strangled, her head battered into the floor. It was a horror that left scars, unanswered questions, grief, resentment. For nearly 23 years, the case stood unsolved. No resolution, no closure. Her daughter, her friends, her community were left grasping for a truth that seemed to slip through their fingers. Over those years, rumors, suspicions, flickers of suspicion, none led to arrest. The case went cold, filed away among so many others that never got their justice. Then, in June 2024, something changed. DNA evidence collected from that original crime scene all those years ago was compared against new samples, and it matched a man named Eugene Gligor. Suddenly, the name that had been whispered in hopes and fears became real. A former boyfriend of Leslie Prier's daughter, Lauren Prier, he was arrested in his home in Washington, D.C. He was 45 years old, an adult shaped by 2 decades of time, doing life outside the spotlight, but with this secret always somewhere in his past. The newly released video from Fox 5 DC gives us a raw, unfiltered view of what happened that night. It shows the moment detectives brought in Eugene Gligor, placed him in handcuffs, walked him into an interrogation room, and confronted him slowly, surely, inexorably with the evidence. They tell him his DNA was found at the crime scene, that he was there when Leslie Prier died. They tell him that her body showed signs of violence, more than strangulation, more than the silent terror of suffocation. There was bashing, there was rage. And they watch him. He is quiet, defensive, maybe frightened. "I'm feeling a little bit caught off guard," he says. In that line there is surprise, denial, distance. The camera watches his face, tries to read whether tears fall. He says, "There's no tears coming out of your face." He replies, "I'm very dry right now." There's something haunting in that exchange, something that speaks not just of guilt or innocence, but of human layers, shame, memory, fear, regret. Behind every crime there is a victim. Not just Leslie, but her daughter, Lauren, who had known the man now accused of killing her mother. They dated in high school. She had led him into her life. To think someone you once trusted, or at least knew, someone close enough that blood relations and family made him familiar, could commit such an act is an extra layer of betrayal. When the video came out, it wounded her all over again. She said he was a killer in plain sight. Not a stranger, not someone from the outside, someone in her family, someone part of friends. And he was right there. The horror of that realization, the horror that someone could be hiding in plain view, wearing a mask of normalcy, doing normal life while carrying something monstrous inside, it's deeply unsettling. Let's go back to the making of the case. In 2001, after Leslie Prier was found dead in her home, there was little to go on. The crime scene was brutal, the head battered, the signs of strangulation. But forensic science was different then. DNA technology had advanced, but databases were smaller, less connected. Investigators may have gathered samples, blood, skin cells, fibers, but maybe there was no match at the time. Gligor may have been a suspect, or someone whom people suspected, or maybe no one suspected him deeply enough. It's not uncommon in cold cases to have persons of interest known to the victim, friends or ex-partners, anyone who might have reasons to be involved, but proof eluded investigators. Memories fade, evidence degrades. People move away, die, forget, lie. Over the years, perhaps the investigation touched on Gligor, or perhaps it didn't. We don't know exactly when investigators first considered him. The article doesn't fully reveal whether tips, rumors, whispered suspicions were followed. But what we do know is that eventually modern forensic work, improved DNA comparison, better cataloging, maybe even advances in processing old samples, made a match. The crime scene DNA matched a DNA sample from Gligor. He had never been convicted until now. He was arrested only in 2024. Why then? Possibly because the sample got into newer databases or because something else prompted re-examination. Sometimes it's renewed public interest. Sometimes it's cold case units that finally have the resources to look back. Maybe someone came forward. The article doesn't say that much. But what it does say is that when detectives brought him in, they had what they needed to make their case. They told him, from the crime scene, the DNA that was taken, we know that you were there at the time when Leslie died. That's the turning point. That's when something he might have thought was buried forced its way forward. He didn't immediately confess. He said he didn't remember. He appeared, at least in the video, caught off guard, flustered, shaken. There are moments in the recording where he seems to search his memory or claim that it's blank. It's not clear whether he was trying to evade or whether he truly couldn't remember. Or perhaps both. Such things can be a defense, consciously or unconsciously. But it's powerful to see someone confronted with physical, scientific proof and watching what happens. The denial, the cracks, the attempt at rationalization or distance. I'm very dry right now. His reactions tell part of the story. Silence tells another. The detectives press. They show him that his DNA matches, that the victim's head was battered into the floor. They tell him that the person they believe did this is someone who knew her, or at least was close enough to know her home, to know her routines, to be in her space. They tell him that the evidence places him there. All that remains in that interrogation room is whether he will speak. Will he admit it? Will he own up? Or will he cling to silence, to denials, to whatever memory gaps he can claim? Lauren, the daughter, the person whose life was irrevocably altered, sits on the sidelines, or in the recording, or watching parts of the video. Her words are piercing. He killed my mom, and it's terrifying. Think for a moment how many people feel that way when someone they cared for, someone they never thought capable, turns out to be a murderer. She says that parts of the video left her feeling awful. Of course, it's not just what he says, it's what he doesn't say. It's the gap between his words and the evidence. The gap between someone who was in her life, someone she once trusted, and someone who took her mother away. When he says, "I don't remember," she hears lies. She says, "I know he's lying." The betrayal lies not only in the act, but in the denial, the evasion, the silence. Finally, in that interrogation, Eugene Gligor asks for a lawyer. At that point, the wheels are turning towards resolution. He later pleads guilty, not to first-degree murder, but to second-degree. That is, the court accepts that the killing was intentional, or at least knowing, but perhaps without premeditation to the degree required for first-degree. He admitted guilt. He faces sentencing. Justice, after more than 22 years, is finally catching up. Still, closing this chapter doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't erase every question. It doesn't erase the years of wondering, the years of suspicion, the years of worrying whether justice would ever be done. For Lauren, for the family, for the neighbors who thought maybe the case was cold but not forgotten, this is a reckoning. And for all of us, it's a reminder. Time doesn't always heal. Sometimes it buries things. But sometimes, when old evidence meets new technology, when memories are jolted, when someone speaks up, even years later, justice can still arrive.
As we move through this story, we'll explore not only what happened on that chilling night in 2001 and what the evidence shows, but we'll also walk through the investigation, the catching of clues, the mechanisms of cold case work, the human cost, especially for those left behind. We'll dig into how DNA, tiny, invisible, became a key that couldn't be locked away. How detective work is as much about patience as urgency, and how a person's private truths, over years, can remain hidden until the light becomes so bright there's nowhere left to hide.
When you look at a cold case, especially one that stayed unsolved for more than 20 years, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the night of the crime, to the final moments of a life that should have carried on, that was taken instead. It was May 2001 in Chevy Chase, Maryland. The house of Leslie Prier sat quiet in the evening, the kind of suburban calm that gives you a false sense of safety. This was a neighborhood where you'd expect children playing in yards, neighbors waving to each other, doors left unlocked because nothing bad ever really happened. But inside that home, something unspeakable was unfolding. Leslie was attacked. The reports later revealed she had been strangled, but that wasn't the only violence inflicted on her. Her head had been slammed into the floor. The brutality of it suggests not just an intent to kill, but an explosion of rage, an emotional storm. Murders like these are rarely random. They're personal. They're fueled by anger, resentment, bitterness, emotions that don't belong to a stranger breaking into a house. What investigators found that night was a scene frozen in violence. Imagine them walking into that room, the silence still heavy in the air, the signs of struggle visible, the weight of tragedy pressing against every wall. Every detective knows when a crime is personal. The closeness of the attack, the way strangulation requires you to be face-to-face, hands wrapped around the victim's neck, it's a crime that demands proximity, that forces the killer to see the life draining from their victim's eyes. That's not something you do to a stranger on impulse. That's something born of connection, twisted though it may be. But in 2001, despite the horror, investigators didn't have enough to go on. Yes, they collected evidence, blood, hair, fibers, fingerprints, and crucially, DNA. But DNA databases at that time were nothing like they are today. There were far fewer samples to compare it against, and in many cases, those samples just sat in storage, waiting for science to catch up. Police interviewed family, friends, neighbors. They looked at people who might have had a reason, but nothing stuck. No confession, no clear suspect. And as the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the case slipped further into uncertainty. For Leslie's daughter, Lauren, this was not just a murder. It was the ripping apart of her entire world. Her mom was gone, and in the shadows of grief, there was fear. Fear that the person who did this was still out there, free, maybe even someone she even knew. Imagine the paranoia. Imagine looking at people in your circle and wondering if one of them held the secret of your mother's last moments. And here's where the story starts to twist, because Lauren wasn't just anybody. She was someone who, in her teenage years, had dated Eugene Gligor. Back then, he was just another young man, someone she brought home, someone her mother met, someone who was part of her life for a time. Relationships end, people move on, but those connections, those memories stay. And now, years later, that same man would become the suspect. Think about the psychological weight of that realization. To know that someone you once cared for, someone you might have shared laughs with, could later be accused of murdering your mother. It turned your entire personal history upside down. It makes you question everything, every word, every smile, every goodbye. Was there something hidden all along? But back in 2001, no one had the proof. Maybe some had suspicions, but suspicion is not evidence. The detectives needed something solid, something undeniable, and they didn't have it yet. So the years passed. 20 years of silence. And in those years, Eugene Gligor lived his life. He grew older, he worked, he had friends. He walked the streets like anyone else. Maybe he thought the past had buried itself. Maybe he thought he'd gotten away with it. Or maybe he tried not to think about it at all. People who commit crimes sometimes find ways to compartmentalize, to lock away those memories like a dark box in their mind. But no matter how deep you bury it, the truth waits, and DNA never forgets. Fast forward to 2024. Cold case detectives, armed with better tools, reopened Leslie Prier's file. They re-examined the evidence. The DNA sample that had once been useless suddenly became a weapon of truth. Technology had advanced to the point where even degraded samples could be compared with incredible accuracy. And this time, the match was clear. The name on that match was Eugene Gligor. And that brings us into the interrogation room, the place where 23 years of silence collided with undeniable science. Detectives sat across from him, evidence in hand. They told him straight, your DNA was found at the crime scene. You were there. The confrontation was chilling, not because he erupted in anger, but because of his calm deflection. He said he didn't remember. He said he was caught off guard. He said he was dry, no tears. Now let's pause on that moment. Most of us, if we were wrongly accused of murdering someone, would erupt in outrage. We'd shout, we'd demand answers, we'd proclaim our innocence with every breath. But Gligor didn't do that. His response was quiet, subdued, almost calculated. To Lauren, watching that later, it was obvious he was lying. She knew him. She had once known the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes, the way he carried himself. And in that room, she saw not a man caught by surprise, but a man finally cornered by truth. For detectives, this is where the interrogation becomes more than just a conversation. It's a psychological chess match. They lay down the evidence, they watch his reactions, they press the weak points. They know the DNA puts him there. What they need is to see how he cracks or doesn't crack under that weight. And eventually, Gligor stops talking. He asks for a lawyer. That's his right, of course. But the silence speaks volumes. When the evidence is this strong and the accused retreats into legal defense, the story begins to write itself. Later, in court, he pleads guilty to second-degree murder. That plea is a confession of sorts, though one that stops short of full responsibility. First-degree murder requires proving premeditation, planning, a deliberate choice. Second degree still acknowledges intent or knowing action, but without the same degree of planning. Maybe it was rage, maybe it was loss of control, maybe something triggered him that night. We may never know exactly what was in his mind. But what we do know is that he finally admitted what investigators had been waiting for all these years. He killed Leslie Prier. For Lauren, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, justice had finally been served. On the other, it was too late to bring her mother back. The wound of 2001 never healed. It just scarred over. Watching Gligor finally face the consequences must have felt like reopening that wound all over again. But it also gave her clarity. She said it herself. He was a killer in plain sight. For years, he had walked free. For years, she had lived knowing her mother's murderer was still out there. And all along, it was someone she once loved. Someone who sat at her dinner table. Someone she thought she knew. That realization is the kind of nightmare you don't wake up from. This is where the story turns from a case file into something much deeper. Because cold cases are not just about evidence, they're about people. About the families who live in limbo, about the detectives who refuse to give up, about the victims who deserve to be remembered as more than just names on a police report. Leslie Prier was a mother, a woman with dreams and laughter and a life that mattered. Her story deserves to be told. And so when we watch that interrogation tape, we're not just watching a man confronted with his crime. We're watching decades of pain come crashing into the present. We're watching science pull truth from silence. We're watching a family, finally, painfully, get the closure they deserved all along.
There's something uniquely haunting about cold cases. When a murder happens, the urgency in those first hours is like fire. Police swarm the scene. Investigators push for leads. The community buzzes with fear and suspicion. But as days pass with no answers, that fire slowly dims. Weeks go by, then months, and eventually the case folder gets pushed to the back of a shelf. It's not forgotten, not entirely, but it becomes one of many. A life ended violently, and yet the truth remains elusive. That's exactly what happened with Leslie Prier's murder in 2001. At first, detectives worked tirelessly. They combed through her house, they asked neighbors if they saw or heard anything strange, they looked at her relationships and possible enemies. They didn't ignore the case, it just didn't give them the breakthrough they desperately needed. And without a suspect to charge, it sat. For the family, though, the pain never sat still. For Lauren, the daughter, every day was marked by absence. Birthdays, holidays, milestones. Her mother wasn't there. Worse, she had no answer for why. Not knowing who killed your loved one leaves a hole that can't be filled. It's not just grief, it's torment. Every face you see could be hiding the truth. Every silence feels suspicious. And the cruelest part? Life moves on for everyone else. But for the family of the victim, time is frozen on that day. Cold cases test patience and faith. Families learn to live with unanswered questions. Detectives learn to live with files they want desperately to close. And the killers? Some live with paranoia, always looking over their shoulder, waiting for the knock at the door. Others live with arrogance, believing they got away with it, convincing themselves they were smarter than everyone else. In Eugene Gligor's case, he lived more than 22 years without being held accountable. 23 years is a long time. That's an entire lifetime for some people. In that span, Gligor aged from his early 20s to his mid-40s. Think about what that means. He went to work, built relationships, maybe laughed at jokes, maybe walked past police officers without a second thought. He built a life around him while the Prier family lived with a broken one. But here's the thing. About cold cases, they're only cold until technology changes the temperature. And DNA changed everything. In 2001, DNA was already a powerful tool, but it wasn't yet the near-perfect forensic fingerprint we know today. Databases like CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, were smaller, less connected. Local police might collect DNA, but if it didn't match anyone in the system, they were stuck. In Gligor's case, his DNA likely wasn't in the system at all, which meant the sample collected from Leslie Prier's home sat there, unmatched, like a puzzle piece with no picture. Fast forward to 2024. The database is enormous now, constantly updated with samples from arrests, convictions, and even familial DNA searches. Technology has improved so much that even degraded samples, once thought useless, can be revived and matched. This is the revolution that breathes life into cold cases. That's what happened here. Investigators reopened Leslie's file, re-examined the evidence, and finally, the puzzle piece clicked. It matched Eugene Gligor. Now think about the shock of that moment for detectives. After all these years, the computer spits out a name. Suddenly, the shadows have a face. A man who thought he was safe is now exposed. And they didn't waste time. They went straight to him, arrested him, and put him in that interrogation room. That video is chilling not because it shows violence, but because it shows the banality of evil. A man sitting quietly, confronted with the fact that science has placed him at a murder scene. He tries to act confused, caught off guard. He says he doesn't remember. He says he's dry, no tears. These small phrases, almost mundane, are eerie when you realize they're coming from someone accused of such a brutal act. Lauren, watching it later, saw through it. She said she knew he was lying, and who better than her? She had known him years ago, when he was just her boyfriend. She had seen his expressions, heard his tone, watched his body language. She recognized the performance. To her, it wasn't confusion, it was evasion. And this is what cold case justice often looks like. It's not the dramatic confession you see in movies. It's not the killer breaking down in tears, begging for forgiveness. More often, it's subtle. It's quiet. It's a man sitting across from detectives trying to deny the undeniable until the weight of evidence leaves him no choice but to face consequences. When Gligor finally pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, it wasn't the full confession some might have hoped for. It left questions hanging. Why that night? Why Leslie? Was it planned? Was it rage? Was there a confrontation? Did he go there intending to kill, or did something spiral out of control? Those answers may never come. A guilty plea closes the legal case, but it doesn't always close the story. For families, that's both relief and frustration. Relief because there's finally accountability. Frustration because there's still a void of unanswered questions. But the importance of the plea cannot be overstated. It's an admission of guilt.
It's the system saying, yes, this man is responsible. It's a statement to the family that their suffering wasn't ignored, that the system didn't fail them forever. And here's something powerful. Every time a cold case like this is solved, it sends a ripple effect. Other families with unsolved cases see hope. Other detectives get inspired to revisit old files. The public realizes that even after decades, justice can still catch up. It's not just one case, it's a symbol. Let's also think about what it means socially. A case like this shows the double lives some people lead. Eugene Gligor wasn't living in hiding in the woods. He was in Washington, D.C., a city buzzing with people, politics, daily routines. He was in plain sight, as Lauren said. And yet, he was carrying this terrible secret. How many people interacted with him daily without knowing he was accused of killing someone's mother? That's the unsettling part of cold cases. Sometimes the killer isn't a shadowy stranger. Sometimes it's the person right next to you. The interrogation video underscores this unease. The sterile walls of that room, the fluorescent lights, the calm voices of detectives. It feels ordinary, but underneath, it's extraordinary. It's the confrontation of a man with the darkest part of his past. And even though he tries to act like he doesn't remember, the evidence speaks louder than his words. For viewers watching this case unfold now, it's hard not to put yourself in Lauren's shoes. Imagine watching the man who murdered your mother sit there denying, dodging, dry-eyed. Imagine the anger, the disgust, the grief boiling all over again. And then finally hearing him plead guilty. That's not closure. Closure is too neat a word. It's something messier, like stitching up a wound that will always leave a scar. The lesson in this is sobering but important. Time is not always the enemy of justice. Sometimes time is the ally. It allows science to advance, it gives new eyes to old cases, it creates openings for the truth to surface. Leslie's case is proof of that. But yet there's also the haunting thought. What if the technology had come sooner? What if Gligor had been arrested in 2001? What might have been different for Lauren, for her family, for the community that lived in fear? Those what ifs are painful, but they're part of every cold case resolution. So as Gligor is convicted, as the Prier family prepares to move forward with justice finally delivered, we're left with both relief and reflection. This case is over, but its echoes remain. The victim's absence remains. And the story of how it was finally solved is a testament to persistence, patience, and the power of truth that refuses to stay buried. When the gavel finally fell, and Eugene Gligor stood guilty of second-degree murder, there was a strange silence that followed. Justice had been delayed for 23 years, but it had finally arrived. Yet for Leslie Prier's family, especially her daughter Lauren, that silence wasn't comforting. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even closure in the traditional sense. It was something heavier, something far more complicated. Because here's the truth. In stories like these, the courtroom doesn't give you your loved one back. A sentence doesn't undo the crime. A guilty plea doesn't erase the years of suffering. All it does is acknowledge reality, that the person who lived freely for so long was in fact guilty of taking a life. That acknowledgement matters. It matters deeply. But it's also incomplete. Lauren put it in words that cut to the bone. He was a killer in plain sight. Think about how that sentence reverberates. The man who once sat across from her at family dinners, who once held her hand in teenage years, was the same man who killed her mother. He wasn't hiding in some far-off place. He wasn't on the run. He was right there, living life as if nothing happened. That realization shakes your faith in people. It forces you to wonder, how well do we really know anyone? And this is where we, as an audience, as a community, as people drawn into this story, have to pause. Cold cases aren't just puzzles to be solved. They're windows into the human condition, the capacity for violence, the fragility of trust, and the resilience of those left behind. Leslie's murder was brutal. Strangulation and head trauma. That detail,
her head battered into the floor, has stuck with everyone who's read about the case. It speaks to anger, to force, to a moment of uncontrolled violence. It was not neat, not quick, not merciful. It was rage turned physical. And it happened inside her home, the one place she should have been safe. That's the part that's hardest for so many people. The violation of safety, the destruction of sanctuary. The detectives who worked the case back then must have carried frustration with them for years. Imagine being the one to walk into that crime scene knowing you had to give a family answers, but not being able to deliver them. Detectives don't forget those cases. They linger. They haunt. And then, decades later, to finally be able to walk into a family's home and say, "We got him," that moment is the kind of redemption that keeps investigators going. It validates the years of patience, the years of keeping hope alive even when the trail had gone cold. For the public, the video of the interrogation was a rare glimpse into that moment when truth and denial collide. Watching Gligor sit there, confronted by detectives, trying to downplay, trying to deflect, it's uncomfortable. You want him to break, to confess, to finally say the words, "I did it." Instead, what you get is his lawyer request, his silence, his guilty plea in court later on. It's not satisfying in a cinematic sense, but it's real. And in real life, justice doesn't always look like Hollywood. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's anticlimactic, but it's still justice. The other side of this story, though, is about resilience. Leslie Prayer lived for 2 decades without answers. She grew up, built her own life, carried her grief, and still found the strength to face the truth when it finally arrived. Watching her speak after the guilty plea, you can hear both the pain and the relief in her voice. Pain because her mother's death will always be a wound. Relief because she no longer has to wonder who did it. The name, the face, the truth. It's all out in the open now. That's what cold case resolutions give families. Not healing, but truth. And truth, however hard, is always better than uncertainty. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. This case isn't just about Leslie Prayer. It's about the power of forensic science. It's about how technology, when combined with persistence, can reach back into the past and pull out answers. The DNA collected in 2001 was waiting, like a silent witness, until 2024. That's more than 2 decades of patience. And when it finally spoke, it did so with clarity. Science doesn't forget. Science doesn't lie. That's a lesson for other families out there waiting for answers to their own cold cases. This isn't just Leslie's story. It's a reminder that time doesn't always protect killers. It's a reminder that truth has a way of resurfacing even when years have passed. And yet, it's also a cautionary tale. Because for 23 years, a man accused of murder walked free. He lived his life. He could have hurt others. He could have gone on with no accountability. That's the danger of unsolved cases. They leave predators free in the world. That's why investment in cold case units, in forensic labs, in DNA technology is so critical. Justice delayed can be justice denied. But sometimes, as we see here, it can still be justice delivered. So what's the legacy of this case? For one, it's the reminder that victims deserve more than being names in files. Leslie Prayer was not just a case. She was a mother. She was a human being with friends, laughter, a personality. We should remember her as more than the details of her death. Because every time we reduce victims to their final moments, we erase the richness of their lives. The legacy is also in the resilience of survivors like Lauren. She spoke up. She didn't hide from the truth when it finally arrived. She confronted the reality of knowing her former boyfriend had taken her mother's life. That takes strength. That takes courage. And finally, the legacy is in the persistence of detectives. Cold cases are often thankless work, Budgets are small, resources limited, and the cases themselves are frustrating. But every solved cold case is proof that the work matters. Every guilty plea is a validation that persistence pays off. So where does that leave us, the audience watching this unfold more than 2 decades later? It leaves us with questions. How many other killers are living in plain sight, thinking they got away with it? How many families are still waiting for the phone call that will change everything? And how many times will we see DNA, science, and sheer persistence bring justice long after the crime? The story of Leslie Prayer and Eugene Gligor is more than a headline. It's a mirror held up to society. It asks us to confront the darkness that can hide in people we think we know. It asks us to value the science that gives voice to victims who can no longer speak. And it asks us to never forget that behind every case file, there's a human story. A story of love, of loss, of pain, and sometimes, finally, of justice. So, as this case closes, let's not end with Gligor. Let's end with Leslie, a woman whose life mattered, whose memory deserves more than to be defined by violence. A woman whose story, even in tragedy, has helped to shine a light on the power of truth. Justice may have taken 23 years, but in the end, the truth was louder than silence. And maybe, just maybe, that truth can bring some measure of peace to those who loved her most.